Protests are, by their very nature, polarizing events. This is particularly the case when violence is involved. However, non-participating observers typically respond very differently to violence on each side of the protest. While violence by protesters is often met with concern, dismay, and outrage, violence by police is often met with tolerance or even with approval. A significant contributing factor to this disparity is the fact that many people are simply unaware of the scale of violence being inflicted by the police and the extent to which it is a disproportionate response to protester action. This is not coincidental. Police communications with media outlets habitually and deliberately use disarming language intended to conceal the danger of weapons they use against protesters, while artificially inflating the perceived threat level of the protesters themselves. As a consequence, police are typically seen by the general public as responding both defensively and proportionately to a dangerous opponent. In contrast, protesters lose support from the public, who view them as unreasonably violent. This video will demonstrate that such vocabulary benefits the police by implicitly validating the violence they use, and will argue that such wording is used deliberately by the police for this purpose. These points will be covered. Firstly, how police and media use vocabulary delegitimizing protesters. Secondly, how police and media use vocabulary validating police violence. Thirdly, how police and media use vocabulary misrepresenting police munitions. Fourthly, strategies for decoding these disarming words in conversation to inform people more accurately about police violence. Vocabulary delegitimizing protesters. Many scholarly studies have observed that the language used by police and media outlets to describe conflict between the police and civilians demonstrates strong bias in favor of the police and is intended specifically to delegitimize protesters. In an article in the Harvard Journal of Racial and Ethnic Justice, Professor Brian Adamson of the University of Michigan Law School noted that in the media, quote, often protest story description biases emphasize selection bias preferences and conform to crime scripts, end quote. Citing prejudicial language used to describe civil protests, such as riots, carnivals, and clashes, he observed that, quote, the invocation of public opinion about protest issues or public reactions to protesters also tends to delegitimize demonstrations, end quote. Adamson also commented that news reports often fail to, quote, explain the meaning and context of protest actions, end quote, with the result that, quote, audiences may indeed see them as futile and even irrational, end quote. In an article published in the New Political Science Journal in 2006, Professor Jules Boykoff of Pacific University in Oregon quoted a media report of protests against the World Trade Organization conference in Seattle during the year 2000. The paragraph quoted is worth reading in full. Quote, thousands of chanting activists, some wearing combat boots and gas masks in preparation for violent clashes with police, mobbed the streets of the nation's capital and tried to disrupt meetings of world finance leaders yesterday, the first such demonstration since the riotous protests against the World Trade Organization in Seattle last fall. Police squirted tear gas at one point, and an isolated group of self-described anarchists repeatedly tried to break through police barriers, smashing security car windows and splashing emergency vehicles with red paint, end quote. Breaking down this media report, it's easy to see specific phrases used with the deliberate intent of vilifying and delegitimizing the protesters. They are described as, quote, thousands of chanting activists, end quote, quote, wearing combat boots and gas masks, end quote. We read that they are, quote, in preparation for violent clashes with police, end quote. We are told that they, quote, mobbed the streets, end quote, and, quote, tried to disrupt meetings, end quote. Other phrases used to describe them are, quote, riotous protests, end quote. And we are told that they, quote, repeatedly tried to break through police barriers, end quote. We are also told of the damage that they inflicted, which is described as, quote, smashing security car windows, end quote, and, quote, splashing emergency vehicles with red paint, end quote. This phrasing is clearly intended to depict the protesters as uncontrolled agents of violence who gathered in force, having prepared themselves deliberately with the aim of causing conflict and destroying property. In contrast, the single, very short reference to the police describes them only in a highly defensive role. We are simply told, quote, police squirted tear gas at one point, end quote. There are no details of the volume of tear gas or at whom it was directed. Additionally, as we shall see, the very term tear gas itself is deeply and deliberately misleading. The entire report gives the strong impression that the police were barely present and completely overwhelmed. The protesters are said to have, quote, repeatedly tried to break through police barriers, end quote, again giving the impression that the police were passive and defensive agents being attacked by aggressors. In order to delegitimize the protesters further, the report described them as having deliberately smashed security car windows and damaged emergency vehicles. The terms security car and emergency vehicles are used very specifically to identify the protesters as having mindlessly destroyed equipment with the sole function of providing for public safety, framing the protesters as enemies of the public, not merely enemies of the police. Vocabulary validating police violence. Just as police and media vocabulary delegitimizes protesters, so it is also used to validate police violence. Citing the Ferguson Police Department response to the shooting of 18-year-old unarmed black man Michael Brown by police officer Darren Wilson, Professor Brian Adamson described the police department as making, quote, a systematic effort to control the Brian Wilson narrative, end quote, just hours after the event. He quoted a media headline which paraphrased the police framing of the shooting with the words, quote, Ferguson teen struggled over officer's gun before being shot to death, end quote. This wording not only suggested that Brown initiated the conflict by seizing the officer's weapon, but implied that Brown did so with lethal intent. Meanwhile, although the title identified Brown as being, quote, shot to death, end quote, it specifically avoided any hint that the police officer was responsible, instead giving the impression of an accidental death resulting from the two men grappling with the firearm. Read less sympathetically, the title gave the strong impression that Brown had in fact caused his own death, while exculpating the officer completely. Adamson also described how police vocabulary in conference with the media was used to sanctify Wilson as a, quote, gentle, quiet man, end quote, and a, quote, distinguished officer, end quote, deliberately framing him as a man incapable of murder. In her book, The Politics of Force, Media and the Construction of Police Brutality, published in 2000, historian Regina G. Lawrence explains how the police control narratives of their use of force against civilians, writing, quote, the typical news story about use of force is brief, episodic, and structured around claims provided by police spokesmen and politicians, end quote. Lawrence describes a double standard by which police force is individualized, allowing inappropriate levels of force to be either dismissed as the illegitimate action of the proverbial bad apple or rogue cop, or else justified as a legitimate response to, quote, violent criminal suspects who threaten officers and the public, end quote. Lawrence writes, quote, this kind of coverage normalizes what some might call brutality and marginalizes competing perspectives on the existence of brutality problems and the causal roots of police violence, end quote. In 2011, an article on the National Public Radio website by Edward Schumacher Matos made an astute observation about the vocabulary used by police to describe the actions they took against the Occupy Oakland movement. Entitled "Non-Lethal Projectiles Was Non-Accurate Police Speak in Occupy Oakland Clash," the article demonstrated praiseworthy self-awareness by opening with criticism from its listeners. Here is the article's opening paragraph. Quote, "When Scott Olson, an Iraq veteran demonstrating at last week's Occupy Oakland protest, was badly injured, NPR reported he was struck by a non-lethal projectile fired by police. Some listeners immediately objected to the description, repeated on Morning Edition and in hourly newscasts." End quote. Schumacher Matos quoted several listeners raising the objection that the term non-lethal projectile was highly misleading, considering the fact that the protester struck by it was hospitalized in a critical condition and the fact that the projectile obviously had the potential to kill. Carrie Khan, the reporter who used the term, explained that given the police had a, quote, "wide array of arsenal from which to choose," end quote, some of which were lethal, the term non-lethal projectile was, quote, "the best choice of words to use," end quote. Khan further pointed out that she had stated explicitly that a protester hit by the projectile was, quote, "hospitalized in critical condition," end quote, which she said, quote, "highlights the immense harm these projectiles can do, even if they are classified as non-lethal," end quote. Schumacher Matos also quoted Daryl Stevens of the Major Cities Chiefs Police Association explaining a gradual shift in police vocabulary, saying, quote, "In recent years, most police use the term less lethal, recognizing that these tools can sometimes cause or contribute to someone's death," end quote. Finally, Schumacher Matos made the particularly pertinent observation that the vocabulary used to describe such munitions has a powerful framing effect which influences public perception in a significant way. To illustrate this, he invited readers to consider how such munitions would sound if they were described more accurately. Schumacher Matos wrote, quote, "Labeling them non-lethal focuses on the intention of the object, crowd control. But what if they were called deep bruising projectiles? This intention has a whole different feel. Or bone-chipping projectiles," end quote. Schumacher Matos stopped short of calling for a significant change in media language when describing the weapons police use against protesters. Nor did he imply that police vocabulary is intended specifically to give a false impression of their safety. Perhaps he did not realize that these are in fact the natural implications of his own observations. Alternatively, perhaps he did take that mental step, but decided it would be a little incendiary to make it explicit. Vocabulary misrepresenting police munitions. Vocabulary used by police to describe their response to protests implicitly validates their actions while disguising the level of violence employed. Terms such as crowd control and crowd dispersal portray the police as taking peaceful actions as a necessary response to large groups of unruly people. Terms using the word riot are used in front of words describing police violence in order to mitigate and justify that violence. The word riot is a particularly effective tool for this purpose and is often positioned in such a way as to soften or distract from the implicit violence of police action. This is particularly the case whenever police weapons are cited. In the terms riot control, riot gun, and riot bullets, the word riot is used to frame police action in a justifiable way. Riots need control. Police aren't using real guns, they're using riot guns. They're not using real bullets, they're using riot bullets. Here's an example in the form of an Associated Press video from the 25th of July 2012. Note the video title, "Anaheim Police Use Rubber Bullets During Unrest." The video content description reads, quote, "Amid raucous protests in Anaheim, California, police deployed rubber bullets and pepper balls to quell a fourth day of unrest overnight Tuesday," end quote. Look at the framing provided by the video's title and content description. It's a combination of delegitimizing the protesters while justifying the police response. Police actions are described in deliberately mitigating terms. The police, quote, deployed rubber bullets and pepper balls, end quote. They didn't fire on protesters, they simply deployed certain countermeasures. Additionally, those countermeasures sound so harmless. Rubber bullets, not real bullets, and pepper balls, which sounds not only perfectly harmless, but almost comical. The police didn't suppress a protest, they simply quelled unrest. And it was about time, because this was, quote, a fourth day of unrest, end quote. That's nearly an entire work week. Seems like the situation was getting totally out of hand, and the police were absolutely needed to restore order. After all, these were, quote, raucous protests, end quote. Sounds dangerous. All of this framing takes place before we even view the video itself. Let's now look at the video content and see how it's curated to police advantage. It might not be a coincidence that the first weapons we see the police using look just like paintball guns, which make a harmless popping sound. 12 seconds in, however, we see a shotgun being used.
Maintain the line!
Initially, this might seem dangerous, but we're not shown any protesters on screen. In fact, we're given the impression that the protesters are all safely out of range, and the shotgun itself makes a muffled sound, indicating it's not firing live ammunition, but some kind of supposedly non-lethal crowd control munition. 23 seconds in, we're shown an interview with Sergeant Bob Dunn of the Anaheim Police Department. He speaks calmly, although he is wearing a vest that casual viewers may interpret as a bulletproof vest, suggesting he is at mortal risk from the protesters. Listen to the vocabulary he uses.
So far we made 5 arrests for various charges. I can tell you that we've investigated some felonious assaults between protesters, so protester on protester violence. Some other questions that I've received today have involved the use of pepper balls and beanbags. Those have been deployed here in the downtown area. We are working to restore order in the pockets of unrest that still exist here in downtown Anaheim, and we'll be doing so until we restore order.
Sergeant Dunn is clearly highly experienced at this kind of media interview. Look at his language. He says the police have made, quote, 5 arrests for various charges, end quote. He doesn't tell us what those charges are, but he sends the strong impression that the police are just doing their job and are protecting the community from harm. He mentions, quote, felonious assaults between protesters, end quote. Not only does this make the protesters sound dangerously violent, but in case we haven't understood the point he's making, he follows it up with the clarification that this is, quote, protester on protester violence, end quote. So these protesters are so out of control, they're even committing violence against each other. Framed like this, the police response seems almost humanitarian, saving the protesters from themselves. Particularly skillful is his phrasing, quote, some other questions that I've received today involve the use of pepper balls and beanbags, end quote. He doesn't say concerns have been raised at the level of police violence used against protesters, or I'd like to address fears caused by police discharging firearms towards protesters. Instead, he describes his response to a question concerning police use of specific munitions without quoting the exact wording of the question. He acknowledges that pepper balls and beanbags, quote, have been deployed, end quote, which seems to be admirably transparent until the wording is examined more closely. The use of the passive phrase, quote, have been deployed, end quote, gives the curious impression that these munitions have been used, but by unidentified parties. Sergeant Dunn certainly didn't say, we fired pepper balls and beanbags at protesters. When he does describe police actions directly, he tells us the police are, quote, working to restore order, end quote, citing, quote, pockets of unrest, end quote. Again, this places the police on the side of the public, as if they are simply performing a civic duty. Although it should be obvious that police activity will only prolong the conflict, Sergeant Dunn describes the police presence as a necessary response, saying it will continue, quote, until we restore order, end quote. This entire response is quite a masterpiece of propaganda. It's very likely Sergeant Dunn felt the need to be particularly persuasive in this case, given the fact that earlier in 2012 he had been compelled to make a statement about an unarmed man who was shot to death by an Anaheim SWAT team. On that occasion, he was quoted in the media as having said, quote, "We recovered what appeared to be a rifle, and it was later determined to be a BB gun," end quote. Note how this wording attempts to exonerate the police by suggesting very strongly, without claiming explicitly, that the SWAT team's victim was shot because he appeared to be threatening them with a gun, and that this gun was only later discovered to be an air rifle. This highly suggestive wording is very obviously deliberately misleading, intended to legitimize the perception of the victim as a threat, while providing plausible deniability for the police, who cannot be accused of actually claiming their lives were at risk, or claiming that their victim was armed. In fact, the Orange County Register reported that, quote, whether Villegas pointed the BB gun or even had it in his possession at the time is unclear, end quote. Back to the video. After Sergeant Dunn has spoken, we are shown footage of a shop front with broken windows, glass covering the pavement. The camera lingers on this view for 20 seconds before we're shown another shop front, this time a Starbucks cafe, with all the windows totally smashed and the owner preparing to board them up. This lasts a further 23 seconds.
What the protesters are trying to do. They can assemble, they have a right, a free voice, that's fine.
Sergeant Dunn then returns to make additional comments.
So it's an unfortunate set of circumstances. We certainly understand the concern of the community and we're willing to have dialogue with them, but that dialogue cannot go on until the violence and the mayhem down here stop.
Sergeant Dunn's framing is clearly designed to place the blame for all violence on the protesters and present the police as the voice of reason and arbiters of peace. After the initial vague reference to the, quote, unfortunate set of circumstances, end quote, he claims the police, quote, understand the concern in the community, end quote, though he doesn't explain exactly what that concern is. Whether it's concern for the issues which prompted the protests, or concern over the violent response by the police, it remains completely unidentified and thus unacknowledged, completely contrary to the spirit of his words. His next statement, quote, we're willing to have dialogue with them, end quote, depicts the police as extending an olive branch, giving the impression that they are offering an opportunity for peace and rational discussion, while implying that the protesters do not have the same attitude. Having established this positive framing for the police, he then reveals that the police won't be talking with the protesters at all unless they stop their, quote, violence and mayhem, end quote. This skillful use of rhetoric not only depicts the protesters as unruly, unreasonable, and unrestrained, but also justifies further police violence by predicating the cessation of the police presence on protester compliance to police demands. This is an ultimatum framed in rhetorical blackmail, using public opinion as leverage. Straight after this, we're shown our first footage of civilians. We see a handcuffed woman being manhandled by an officer while she protests to the camera that she has been arrested despite doing nothing, and tells us that this behavior is typical of the Anaheim Police Department.
To do anything. I didn't even resist. I was leaving for my homegirl and they got me. For nothing. For nothing. That's Anaheim for you. That's Anaheim cops. That's Anaheim PD for you.
After this 10-second clip, we are shown footage of police cuffing two other people who are being held down with their faces pressed into the ground. This lasts another 23 seconds. There is no voiceover during either of these clips, nor any information provided about who they are or why they were arrested. The woman in the first clip is adamant that she was only a bystander, and there is no indication that any of these people were actual protesters, nor any evidence that any of them were breaking the law. Nevertheless, the fact that this footage was preceded by 90 seconds of visuals and commentary explicitly stating and reinforming the police framing of the event leads viewers to sympathise more readily with the police and automatically view the individuals as unruly protesters who were lawfully restrained in order to prevent them causing additional damage to private property. The video closes with 20 seconds of footage showing police marching in formation and being urged by a voice to, quote, hold the line, end quote, though no other people are visible and no possible threat is identified. This is just one example among countless others of the way in which media are complicit in framing protest events using vocabulary coined specifically to validate police violence and give them the only authoritative voice. Now let's look at strategies to inoculate people against this kind of framing by decoding the language police use and revealing their violence and weapons for what they are. Strategies for decoding disarming words. Let's return to the astute observations by Schumacher Matos in his article on the 3rd of November 2011. Speaking of the so-called non-lethal munitions used by police, Schumacher Matos asked, quote, but what if they were called deep bruising projectiles? This intention has a whole different feel. Or bone-chipping projectiles, end quote. Taking this suggestion one step further, this section of the video presents terminology which I have coined specifically to reveal the true nature of police munitions in order to counter the media narratives which use misleading language to mitigate police violence. I have assembled my suggested terminology following this protocol. 1. Accuracy. I have chosen words specifically to describe munition components as accurately as possible by identifying correctly their primary composition and purpose. 2. Objectivity. I have chosen words specifically to avoid sensationalism. In most cases, they are words used in technical descriptions of the munitions themselves. 3. Integrity. I have chosen words specifically to acknowledge the munition has been designed to reduce, rather than maximize, injury. 4. Pronounceability. I have chosen words specifically to render the terminology easy to pronounce by using no more than 2 syllables per word and keeping each term to a maximum of 6 syllables. In the on-screen descriptions which follow, a vertical line or pipe has been placed between words to indicate a pause as a pronunciation guide. In addition to the suggested terminology, I have also suggested certain phrasing in the form of short and convenient sentences which efficiently and accurately describe the effects of the munition in terms which are easy to understand and hopefully easy to use in everyday conversation. Let's now examine the phrases used to describe police munitions and look at my suggested alternative terminology and phrasing. Anti-riot munitions. This catch-all phrase is used to describe the full range of weapons used by police against what is euphemistically referred to as civil unrest. The word Anti-riot is verbal framing designed specifically to imply that these weapons are only used in response to dangerous or unlawful situations in which large groups of people are out of control. And the word munitions is a technical term used deliberately to avoid identifying these devices as actual weapons. In reality, all of them are capable of causing serious injury, and some of them are particularly prone to causing mutilation or fatalities. Photos and videos of the injuries these weapons can cause are readily available online and are not for the faint of heart. My suggested term for these is anti-protest weapons. My rationale is the word anti-protest describes accurately the real aim of their use in the context of protests, and the word weapons correctly identifies them as dangerous tools designed specifically to cause harm. My suggested phrasing for use in conversation is, why are the police attacking lawfully gathered citizens with anti-protest weapons? Beanbag round. People know what beanbags are. Many of us played with them in kindergarten or elementary school. We remember them as soft fabric bags filled with tiny beans or seeds, loose, floppy, squashy, and harmless. This is not remotely analogous to a beanbag round. Imagine if you heard a beanbag round described with more accurate language. A baton round consisting of a strong fabric bag containing solid lead shot. Now it sounds a lot more like what it really is. A 12-gauge shotgun shell with lead pellets stuffed tightly into strong fabric. Instead of sounding like you're going to be hit with a beanbag, it now sounds more like you're going to be hit with a rock in a sock, and that's a lot more accurate in terms of the effects. Even the more technical name, flexible baton round, gives you a lot more warning about what's going to happen. Intuitively you know that being hit by a baton is going to be nothing like being hit by a beanbag. These munitions are most commonly known for the heavy bruising they cause, but they can also smash goggles, fracture or break bones, or cause internal bleeding. People have suffered blindness, skull fractures, brain trauma, and death by being hit with beanbag rounds to the head. My suggested term for this munition, lead pellet bag bullet. My rationale for this description, the word lead is a clear warning of its dangerous main component. The words pellet bag acknowledge it is not a solid lead slug but a bag of individual pellets, and the word bullet identifies it correctly as a potentially lethal explosively launched projectile. My suggested phrasing for use in conversation is, imagine a police officer hitting you with a rock in a sock at 135 miles per hour. Rubber bullets. The word rubber makes these munitions sound soft and relatively harmless, effectively disarming the word bullet. Imagine how people would react if they were referred to by their more technical term, baton rounds. Hearing the word baton, it's difficult to think of anything other than a hard stick designed specifically to beat people and cause them injury. Although these munitions do have a rubber coating, the rubber component is typically only 20% of the overall projectile, with the remaining 80% consisting of a hard core usually made of rigid metal or ceramic. Even the external rubber has a hardness of 96.5A on the Shore hardness scale, which is harder than a rubber tire at 65 to 70. At close range, these munitions can cause serious injury, mutilation, or death. My suggested term for this munition is blunt metal baton bullet. My rationale for this terminology is, the word blunt acknowledges the munition is designed to reduce injury. The word metal is a clear indication of its dangerous main component. The word baton identifies explicitly its aim to strike the body with painful force, and the word bullet identifies it correctly as a potentially lethal explosively launched projectile. My suggested phrasing for use in conversation is, imagine being hit by a police baton at 135 miles per hour. Sponge grenade. The word sponge is particularly deceptive here. Who could possibly object to being hit with a sponge? It sounds so soft and squashy that it even completely mitigates the word grenade, which gets sneaked in almost as an afterthought. This sounds like a small explosive which launches harmless sponge rubber projectiles. In reality, this is another form of baton round, with a head made from a rigid foam rubber, not sponge rubber, attached to a high-density plastic body. While the head's larger surface area theoretically reduces the risk of injury in comparison with a conventional rubber bullet, these munitions are still highly dangerous, since at close range they can cause the same traumatic bruising, bone breakage, and lethal injuries. At close range, a sponge grenade can penetrate and shatter a windshield. My suggested term for this munition is hard foam baton bullet. My rationale for the terminology: the words hard foam acknowledge the munition is designed to reduce injury while providing a clear warning of its dangerous main component, while the word baton identifies explicitly its aim to strike the body with painful force, and the word bullet identifies it correctly as a potentially lethal explosively launched projectile. My suggested phrasing for use in conversation: a police hard foam baton bullet can penetrate and shatter a windshield, so imagine what it can do to your body. Sting ball grenade. These rubber grenades, filled with rubber pellets, sound like they're only designed to cause a sharp momentary pain, a mere sting. However, the pellets rate 75A on the Shaw hardness scale, which is harder than a rubber tire at 60 to 70. Additionally, the internal pellets are not the greatest danger these weapons represent. A study published by the Florida Gulf Coast University Weapons and Equipment Research Institute in June 2011 found that when the grenade detonated, quote, far more projectiles were released than just rubber balls. The entire body of the grenade has the possibility of becoming shrapnel, end quote. The study said that in tests, although, quote, some grenade bodies remained somewhat intact, end quote, quote, others nearly disintegrated, creating a shower of shrapnel, end quote. According to the study, during testing, some of the sharp, hard rubber shrapnel fragments, quote, passed completely through the panels used for the experiments and became embedded in the wall of the research lab, end quote. The study concluded, quote, sting ball and stinger grenades have a rubber exterior and break apart in a fashion similar to that of a military grenade. As a result, there is a risk of causing severe injuries or death from flying projectiles, end quote. My suggested term for this munition is hard rubber shrapnel grenade. My rationale for this terminology: the words hard rubber acknowledge the munition is designed to reduce injury while providing a clear warning of its dangerous main component. The word shrapnel accurately describes the fact that the munition typically breaks up into multiple potentially dangerous fragments, and the word grenade accurately describes the dangerously explosive method of delivery. My suggested phrasing for use in conversation: a police officer's hard rubber shrapnel grenade can blind you. Stun grenade. This munition is sometimes referred to with the even more innocuous term flashbang. It is a literal grenade designed specifically to incapacitate victims by causing deafening concussion and blinding them, supposedly temporarily. It produces intense heat and light using magnesium, which can cause third-degree burns and set clothing and other flammable objects on fire. With a sound level of 160 to 180 decibels, at close range it can burst the eardrum and cause temporary or even permanent loss of hearing. My suggested term for this munition: concuss and blind grenade. My rationale for this terminology: the words concuss and blind identify correctly the munition's real aim using standard technical terminology found on the website of the CDC, and the word grenade accurately describes the dangerously explosive method of delivery. My suggested phrasing for use in conversation: at over 170 decibels, a police concuss and blind grenade can burst your eardrums and destroy your hearing. Tear gas. This is one of the most poorly named and misleading police munitions. It literally sounds like it simply makes people's eyes water, as if it's no worse than cutting onions. In reality, police tear gas is a chemical weapon designed specifically to irritate skin and sensitive membranes with the aim of provoking debilitating respiratory spasms and occluding vision through inflammation of the eyes. Simply put, its aim is to blind and choke. Ironically, the use of tear gas is illegal in war under the terms of the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which has been signed by the majority of the world's nations. Despite this, its use by police against civilians has not been prohibited. It's important to let people know that civilian victims of tear gas are being attacked with a weapon which has been outlawed for use in war. My suggested term for this munition: blind and choke gas. My rationale for this terminology: the words blind and choke identify correctly the munition's real aim using standard technical terminology found on the website of the CDC, and the word gas accurately describes how the agent is delivered. My suggested phrasing for use in conversation: police are allowed to use blind and choke gas against unarmed civilians, even though the 1925 Geneva Protocol banned the use of this chemical weapon in warfare. Now let's see how the use of this language can provide a different perspective on reporting. Here's some text from a Shanghai China Morning Post article. Quote, "Police confirm use of sponge grenades, rubber bullets, and 55 cans of tear gas. Head of Police Public Relations says, 'We think the force we used was lawful and proportionate.'" End quote. Now let's replace the police-friendly vocabulary with the terms suggested here. Quote, "Police confirm use of hard foam baton bullets, blunt metal baton bullets, and 55 cans of blind and choke gas. Head of Police Public Relations says, 'We think the force we used was lawful and proportionate.'" End quote. Let's also summarize the event with suggested phrasing, as if describing it in conversation with someone easily swayed by the standard vocabulary used to describe police violence. That news report is using very misleading wording. Imagine being hit with a baton at 135 miles per hour, shot with a hard foam baton bullet which can shatter a windshield, and gassed with a chemical weapon which the 1925 Geneva Protocol prohibited for use in war. Then the person responsible says it's lawful and proportionate force because you broke a window. If that's lawful and proportionate force, then why do they feel the need to conceal it with deliberately misleading language? This might help turn the conversation in a more productive direction. Conclusion. The challenge of vocabulary validating police violence is complex, and this video certainly isn't a silver bullet solution, if you'll pardon the munitions metaphor. However, hopefully it provides a useful tool with which to engage others on the topic and encourage them to think more critically about protest events and the language used to describe them. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe.